Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Fostering Trauma-Informed Consumer Leadership. I am Catherine Kavanaugh, and I will be the moderator for this webinar, presented by the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council as a part of our spring virtual training, with the support from the Health Resources and Service Administration and the Bureau of Primary Health Care. This session is being recorded. Today we are going to hear from two speakers, myself and Sir Nick Apostoleris, who is a PhD who runs a community health center, and I am the consumer advocate with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. I provide staff support for our consumer engagement work. So for today's webinar, we're going to be talking about why trauma-informed care is important for consumers to know, how trauma-informed care can help our leaders ensure safe environments and organizational support, and provide some tips and tools on how to really build leadership development into the various types of engagement work for our consumers. As we get started in this conversation, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about here and have some common definitions. So when we're talking about trauma-informed leadership, what we mean to say by that is leadership that really understands the impacts of trauma and make sure that it's aware of how those impacts affect a person, to make sure that we are creating spaces that are open and welcoming. The atmospheres and structures really acknowledge the possibilities for re-traumatization and make sure that we are not re-traumatizing people and that we are not creating new traumas for people. These things are especially important when we're talking about our consumer engagement work because we know there is a high prevalence of trauma for people experiencing homelessness. People experiencing homelessness have a number of traumas before they experience homelessness, and then we know that the experience of losing your housing and being without a home is traumatic in of itself. So being able for our consumers to understand that trauma and mitigate the impacts that trauma has on thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and interactions is important for our consumers who are acting as leaders in a variety of ways. Some of the ways we're going to talk about today are with consumer advisory boards. Probably from here on out, I will refer to those as CABs. Consumer advisory boards are advisory groups that work with our health centers in order to improve the quality of healthcare at our sites. They are consumer-led, consumer-run, so these are really consumer-driven spaces. And we want to make sure that those spaces are trauma-informed and engaging as possible so we can really be representing the most diverse and representative population of our consumers. And when we talk about trauma, we specifically talk about three different aspects of trauma that's important to understand. Sometimes this is referred to as the 3 E's. That is specifically the event itself, how people experience that event, and what are the effects of that event. The combination of these three factors will really impact how a person experiences that trauma and how it affects their daily lives. So when we talk about the events, these events can affect individuals, groups, or communities. They can be single events. There can be multiple events over the course of time, or it can be really chronic conditions like poverty and homelessness. But when we talk about the event itself is significant, but it's also about how we experience that event. It's how we label and how we assign meaning to that event, which will heavily impact whether we experience it as traumatic or not. And then the effects of the event we will talk about in a second here, and those really impact a number of aspects of a person's life. But when we're looking at kind of these events and how people experience it, it's also important to note that we need to look through this really through a socio-cultural lens in how cultures and how society really impacts how people experience these events. And then again, when we're talking specifically about the effects of traumatic events, we need to realize that these can have short and long-term consequences. Trauma really affects functioning. It can also affect mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being for people. When we talk about these effects, how they impact a person's daily lives, their thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and interactions, it's important to note that these reactions are normal reactions to abnormal situations. We want to make sure that we understand that these reactions do not make people bad people or difficult people. They are survival mechanisms that our brain and our bodies instinctually react to make sure that we survive in a healthy manner for ourselves, that it's effective in how we cope with these events. So these are normal reactions to abnormal situations. It's important for our consumers who are leading consumer spaces to understand a number of various aspects of trauma that you see because of this idea that we want to make sure that our consumer spaces are as safe as our clinical spaces. Our consumers are leading people in a variety of work, and we want to make sure that everyone who is engaging our consumers and working with people experiencing homelessness really understand how behaviors, thoughts, and interactions impact trauma. So we're not discounting people or dissuading them from engagement because we believe they are difficult or we don't know how to interact with them. It's important for us to understand that we want to engage all perspectives and all voices at this table. So we want to make sure we know how these trauma impacts people so we know how to engage them best. It's also a key factor to understand these different aspects of trauma because of the importance of recovery. Recovery from trauma is possible, and knowing some of these key factors and how to help others recover helps us to create the spaces, the safe spaces we want to see, which Nick will be discussing in a little bit. And we really want to make sure our consumers are creating spaces that normalize symptoms, that provide social support, that engage empowerment and choice for people, and really provide for safety in order to best support the recovery of people from trauma. And again, when we talk about why it's important for our consumer leaders to really have skills and training and background and support in trauma-informed leadership, it is because we want our spaces, our consumer spaces, to be as inclusive and diverse as possible. We want to make sure that our consumer spaces are reflective of our clients, that we are adequately representing the perspective and experiences of people experiencing homelessness, which means that we will have people who have experienced trauma at the table, people who have struggled with their mental health, people with substance use disorder, people with various identities that have experienced oppression or discrimination through their lives. And we want to make sure that all of those people have a safe space at the table. We want to make sure we are representing all of our clients adequately, which means we need to be grounded in trauma-informed care, trauma-informed engagement for all of those folks so they feel welcome in our spaces and encouraged to participate. We want to really create meaningful engagement that is based on our values of respect and dignity and really founded in shared learning and development. We often talk about the respect for the lived experience and respect for every voice, and we need to create spaces that adequately allow us to fulfill those values. When we talk about trauma-informed leadership, there's a few skills, as you see, that we believe are really important skills in order to support trauma-informed leadership. We're going to delve into these in a little bit here. We just want to remind people that any sort of skill development is a constant process. So we're going to talk about some ideas about why these skills are important and ideas about how you can incorporate that into the consumer engagement programs. But know that this is a constant process. We want to really create open learning communities. These are skills that can never be adequately mastered. It's a It's something that we want to make sure we're consistently involving and retraining ourselves and re-engaging with as a continued process. These skills are fundamentally important because they help us create healthy interactions, build relationships with other people, and then facilitate our personal growth and also the growth of the group and the consumer movement. There's a number of ways that we're going to kind of talk about how you provide for this type of skill development. All of these are great ideas to incorporate into your practices, into your consumer work, and you can do them for a variety of ways. They are not mutually exclusive. As much as you can do of all of this is fantastic. Some ideas of how you do this sort of skill development is providing for some concrete trainings. These can be half days, 2-hour sessions, whatever intensive trainings that are solely focused on these specific skills. They can also be education that's provided during CAB meetings. Some of our CABs take a portion of each of their meetings to focus on some type of education, whether that's education around skill development or education around various services at health centers, but building some of these education into CAB meetings so we're continuously learning and growing is another important skill. Also providing peer mentors for our consumer leaders. A number of our CABs have former chairs who have been engaged for a long time or have consumer leaders who have been engaged for a long time. Having those individuals really act as peer mentors for the new upcoming leaders to really share what they have learned around these skills, and then also helping to provide some feedback to other consumer leaders around how they're doing with skills, how they could improve, and just really creating support and dialogue is important. So using peer mentors is important. Also debriefing after meetings and opening space during meetings to have some of these conversations about good times when we see these skills, when someone demonstrates one of these skills that we think is important, or when we are struggling with one of these skills. It's important for us to be able to acknowledge that before, after meetings, so we're all learning and growing. And it also helps to demystify some of these skills a bit. If we're able to acknowledge when we're doing well or when others are need help or need growth, and we're able to support one another, creating those spaces where we feel safe to acknowledge our strengths and also our opportunities for growth really is the foundation of understanding that you have created a safe space when everyone feels comfortable acknowledging those things. So it's fundamentally, to develop these skills, it's important to have a foundation that's based in some of this training and education, but also providing some real opportunities to practice these skills during meetings, in recruitment opportunities, either through like outreach or health fairs, or the variety of other opportunities that our consumer leaders engage in. So going through some of these skills a little bit, when we talk about communication, there are a lot of facets of communication that we often overlook. It's about how we deliver messages. It's also how we receive messages. We want to be considerate about how are we ensuring that our messages are heard and also interpreted as we wish to put them out into the world. This is something we talk about in NCAB is often the platinum rule, which I'm not sure if people are familiar with, but the platinum rule expands on the golden rule a little bit. The idea is that we treat people as they want to be treated, not the way that we want to be treated. We know we are all different, so we want to treat people and engage people the way that they need to be or want to be engaged. And part of that is based in communication. We want to talk to people in a way that they respond to, in a way that they feel engaged with. So part of that is knowing what your communication style is, knowing what others' communication styles are, and knowing really how to listen and how to engage in respectful dialogue with people that is based in how they will best receive that message. Some exercises that people do in CAB meetings or with consumers, all of us have done probably in the past, in order to really fine-tune some of our communication skills, can be very simple exercises around listening, reflecting what we have heard, and also role plays about either positive or negative interactions that we have seen around communication styles, so we can better understand what we want to do differently next time. As I talked about the importance of knowing how others want you to communicate with them and how you communicate best, this is really grounded in ideas of emotional intelligence. We need to be able to tell how we're feeling and how that's being portrayed to others. We know that emotions are warning systems that are telling us that we need to we need to understand what they are telling us and how we're translating what they're telling us to other people. We want to make sure that we know how we react to different triggers or how we react to different spaces, how those emotions well up in us, and how that affects how we interact with other people. Especially when we're talking about trauma-informed engagement, we don't want our emotional space to be re-triggering to other people. So if our emotions are getting triggered, it's important to know how we can be engaging in self-care to de-escalate ourselves so we're not creating a negative space for those around us based on our heightened emotions. Ideas for how CABs can really do this is to be creating some spaces for introspection and how we as individuals are triggered, what our warning signs are, or how we react to things. Knowing these things about ourselves is an important first step, and then especially for our consumer groups, if these are groups that interact with each other, that there's a core group of people that consistently are coming, knowing how each other's react, what each other's triggers are, what their warning signs are. If people are comfortable sharing those things with others, but they can help support one another when they're noticing heightened emotions in each other. Another important trauma-informed leadership skill is group participation. I want to reiterate something. There's an idea that this workshop is focused on, or this webinar is focused on consumers because we want to make sure that we are helping share our clinical knowledge with consumers so they are creating the same spaces that we want to be creating in organizations. But a lot of these skills and a lot of the areas where we're talking about how these skills are demonstrated are relevant to everyone. And with that foundation, I want to acknowledge that all groups are hard. All groups have difficult dynamics or difficult people. This is not something that is solely based on our consumers, as most of these situations are not. These are very common human experiences. So understanding your team and understanding their strengths is an important foundation for all groups. Especially with our consumers, it's important for CABs and especially the CAB leaders to know different things about the group, know what their emotions are, how they react to things, how different personalities work together so they can draw out the best in everyone and also work towards any conflict resolution, which we'll talk about in the next slide a little bit. Group participation is also important for our group leaders because we want to make sure that we are providing for equitable engagement. Again, our consumer groups are meant to be diverse and inclusive spaces that are broadly representative of our populations. And we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable at that table and also has a shared power in that space. We want everyone to feel comfortable engaging and open to sharing their thoughts and opinions in a safe way. So it's important for everyone to feel comfortable engaging and then also feel comfortable disagreeing with another. We want to have spaces where dissenting opinions are allowed and able to be worked through. A tip on how to provide some of our consumer leaders with ideas about how they can best facilitate these groups to create these kind of spaces is really offering some of this debrief and feedback spaces either during or after the meeting. Again, this is important where our peer mentors can really provide some space for how that meeting facilitation went, what could be improved in the future. It's also important to allow space for group participants to share how they felt the meetings were being facilitated. We want to create as much space as we can for people to be sharing their reactions within the group rather than leaving the meeting, leaving the group, and then talking amongst themselves afterwards, one-on-one, and in spaces where the group isn't really allowed to talk about it or process it together and make sure that the group together is learning and growing from it. So creating spaces within the group for participants to give feedback is important too. And then when we talk about conflict resolution, I want to go back to kind of what I said in the last slide, is this idea that disagreement can be a very healthy thing. It means that people are engaged in the process. It means that they care. People are willing to share opinions. It's always a good sign that people have an opinion and they want to share it and they want to contribute to the group. Where we want to make sure we're balancing things is where some of those dissenting opinions and disagreements are done in a respectful way. Especially when we're talking about trauma-informed leadership, conflict can be very re-traumatizing for people. So we want to do as much as we can to really mitigate any conflicts or escalated tensions between people and make sure we're creating spaces that allow for respectful disagreements but don't cross the line over into conflict that is aggressive, where people can be really re-traumatized by that. So this is important for some of our consumer leaders, the chairs or support staff, to really be modeling what healthy disagreement and what boundaries are. I think a lot of us have experience with I statements. It's important to be using some of those I statements to make sure that we are speaking for ourselves and our feelings and our reactions. We're not putting things on the group. We're trying to speak for the group. And we're also working to find common ground, making sure that we're all grounded in why the group is here, what the mission is, and we're moving towards that, and not allowing some of our personal conflicts to get in the way of the group goals. So this is one area where I will say I think training is important as a foundation, and then making sure that we continue to build out space for development after that. But I think that the base training for de-escalation is important because that's a very specific clinical skill that we want to be sharing with our consumer leaders. Another idea for consumer advisory boards that's important is making sure that they're creating ground rules ahead of time, having discussions when they're setting up bylaws or guidelines for how the group is structured, having guidelines and ground rules for how they interact with each other. So we have a chance to kind of talk about what are healthy interactions, what are the boundaries, so then when situations come up later, we can really be as proactive and not as reactive. We want to be as proactive as we can, because if we're constantly being reactive, it can lead to some more tense and highly escalated situations. Finally, the last skill that we're going to talk about here is cultural humility. Cultural humility is something we talk about a little bit different than cultural competency. Cultural humility is grounded in this idea that people should be able to define their own personal culture, their heritage, their language, their traditions, how they want to represent and how they experience their culture. It's not about us generalizing or assuming what people's cultures are based on their name or their appearance. It's really allowing people to identify with the culture that they want and how they identify with any particular culture. One great way to really be, for consumer advisory boards to be engaging with cultural humility is to be using storytelling, making sure that we're giving spaces in our meetings for each of us to be talking about things that are important to us, where our passions are, our experiences, and how those have been shaped. Engaging storytelling either during the meeting or storytelling projects from the CAB can really help us differently understand different cultures, but also how different people interact with those cultures and getting to know each other on a very personal basis. So I think storytelling engagement with culture of humility is really important. Now I will be handing this over to Nick, who's going to be talking about how we create the safe spaces that really can foster this leadership development.
Thank you, Catherine. This is Nick Apostoleris here. Our next slide, we have relevant values, and I think that I needed to let the group know, let the audience know, the participants know, what I found upon reflection were the values that guided my work in groups, clinically and as a manager. And I'd say the first that came to me was respect for individuals and communities, and the differences between individuals and the differences among community members, as well as between communities. Authenticity, when I say authenticity, I mean a sense of transparency, of communicating directly, respectfully, but clearly, and having that reflect your honest beliefs, honest emotions, without those emotions or beliefs being expressed in a damaging way. Egalitarianism, by that I mean that everyone in an organization, everyone in a community is of equal inherent value, irrespective of their attributes, irrespective of their position, irrespective of their resources. The people are of equal value, and if that's a truly held belief, then all sorts of what I think are constructive sequelae come from that. All sorts of constructive outcomes happen. And if we start getting into belief systems that don't accept egalitarianism, we can quickly get into hierarchical arrangements that replay oppression that is in families and replay oppression that's in communities and cultures. Humility is, Catherine mentioned humility before. I think humility can be the sort of linchpin as to whether an engagement works or not. When people say, I know what you're feeling, or I know what you've gone through, you can look around a room and sometimes people are shaking their heads at hearing that or cringing even, because there's a fundamental divide among us in that we don't really know what the other person is feeling, what they've experienced, how what they're hearing interacts with their experiences and their biology. So being comfortable with not knowing that you know all that much and being eager to explore in a respectful, tentative way about other people's experiences. That's what I mean by humility. And then just the value for me is a respect for science, respect for learning and knowledge, and that we can gain knowledge. Combining that with humility, sometimes that isn't done. So sometimes the scientific community can feel overly confident in a current level of knowledge or knowing. And that can be off-putting and also embarrassing when future research finds other truths, tentative truths. So the scientific process is one of continual exploration and trying to get to better approximations of truth and knowledge. And I do believe that values are what drive community, the values of individuals, but those individuals can be expressed as expectations or norms. And when values are shared, it's amazing the power of people wanting a value-driven community to continue. People find worth in sharing community with people who are value-driven, as long as those values are clear and they're pro-social and they're shared. So getting a little more specific, creating safe, productive spaces for consumers is really what we're trying to do, consumers and others. We want people to enter into, we could call it groups, but even those groups are small communities those communities have to have characteristics which allow people to feel safe enough to share and function and not be re-triggered. In addition to values, there's also a spirit. I use the word spirit in the way of saying, you can have all the words right and all the rules right, and you can have all the guidelines and policies and procedures, but if there isn't a spirit of what are we really doing this for, let's try to do things in the spirit of the group, and let's try to do things in the spirit of where we're trying to go instead of going back to written rules, that spirit can really pull people through. That spirit can be fostered by having the right tone. The tone, you want the tone not to be accusatory, you want the tone not to be belittling, you want the tone not to be authoritarian, you want the tone to be encouraging, humble, respectful. Atmosphere. I do think a lot of it's about atmospherics, and as Catherine said earlier about communication being a minority of words and a majority of body language and tone, the atmosphere matters. Is the atmosphere one that is institutional, hierarchical, punitive? If it is, people might get triggered in different ways around that. Some people may have had experiences in environments where that atmosphere brought bad outcomes for them, and they might not be able to participate fully. And no matter what you have as the rules and the guidelines, if the spirit's wrong, it's not going to work out. So you can't force things with words and policies. People are very smart and very attuned to the emotional spirit and atmosphere, and people don't feel safe. You can't tell them through words and rules that they should feel safe. They're going to feel the way they feel. That last bullet on this slide of learning when to assume the best of intentions in others. So here's what I mean by that. Things go best, in my experience, when people assume best of intentions in others. You can be more constructive when if someone says something that could be interpreted either in a constructive way or a destructive way, if the first take is to interpret someone's words constructively and maybe ask for clarification, but not get defensive or not get nasty, things go better because nasty begets nasty. So, but the world is not always a safe place. So people have learned that you better not always assume the best of intentions in others, or you might not be safe. So the goal is to set up groups, communities, in which more of the time, more of the people can assume the best of intentions in others in the group and let any negatives come out, which will let people know when they're not safe. But in general, to have an assumption of safety and at building that community where it's safer to assume the best. In some communities, in some families, it might be safer not to assume the best. But if we want high-functioning groups and communities, we really want to get to a place where it's safer to assume the best in the other group members. So how do you do this? How do you create these nurturing, safe spaces where people can really function at their best? The biggest thing is listen and being attentive, in my opinion. Listening and being attentive. Being attentive can be hard when you can't wait to say the next thing you're going to say. You have to get that attentional pie that you got. You got only 100% of your attention. If a lot of your attention is focused inwardly in terms of what you're going to say next or other thoughts, it's not focused on the others in the group. And you don't want to only focus on the person who's doing the speaking. You want to be focused on the rest of the room. You want to be focused on how are people responding to the person who's speaking? Are they joining? Are they leaning in? Are they recoiling? Are they looking like they're feeling edgy or upset or things ramping up? So be attentive and listen and get maybe a little bit more off of what you're going to do next and more open to what people around you are doing. Amplifying what I said in off the last slide about focusing on tone rather than on rules, regulations. Trust, respect, openness. Openness to experience. Openness to someone saying something you might not have expected. Or someone saying something, but their facial expression might not match the words. Okay? Someone saying something that one would expect to have sort of a happy tone, but the expression or the body language isn't. You want to just be attentive and open to that and see what that might mean. Be inquisitive, respectfully inquisitive. Atmosphere and body language of people. And people have different body language. Individuals do. So that listening and being attentive, a lot of that happens over time as you get to know the people in the community, in the group, and understand people's baselines. How does that person normally act? How is this different from the way the person normally acts or their normal body language? So guidelines, I've sort of been playing down rigid rules and regulations. However, developing guidelines can really help safety because those guidelines, as long as there's flexibility with them, excuse me, those guidelines allow for reminders, respectful reminders when someone might be nearing a boundary, when their actions in one way or another might be getting close to being out of line. And those guidelines, if they're understood clearly, if they're endorsed through consensus, can allow for a lot of self-monitoring within a group. This last topic on this slide about space considerations. People depending on their background, people depending on their own traumatic experiences may get very uncomfortable if their physical way out is not clear. Some people, they need to, for their anxiety level to go down, they need to be able to leave. And remember, we're talking about trauma-informed and full-blown PTSD, that is an anxiety disorder. And the anxiety associated with a post-traumatic reaction can be heightened if people feel trapped. So we don't want people to feel trapped emotionally. We don't want people to feel trapped physically. And for some people, they really feel these feelings of fear of being trapped in a very heightened way. For other people, they may feel uncomfortable not being able to read the faces of others in the group or the community. Some people might value being able to see the faces, being able to see the others very highly. And what does that imply? That implies not having rows of chairs where one person might be sitting behind another. You don't know. Maybe 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 people, this is not an issue. But for that one person, and you don't know what event might have happened, it might have been something that happened from behind, or it might be that when they have the PTSD exacerbation, some of the thought processes get distorted around paranoia. You don't know. So being sensitive to that, maybe doing some screening and asking people what makes you feel comfortable. How might these chairs be arranged in a more comfortable way? Knowing your group. So creating egalitarian spaces. One way to do that is to always model understanding that there should be equal respect for people in all walks of life, in all positions, including leadership positions. Meaning don't disrespect people who are in leadership positions as a way of sort of knocking people down to size. No, we're looking to empower everyone. We're not looking to knock people down. So evidencing respect for people in all positions, knowing that people are, for the most part, doing the best they can do. Everyone's limited. Everybody's just coming at it with the best tools that they can and trying to do the best they can do, while simultaneously acknowledging power dynamics. And power dynamics can play from a role as a leader. It can come from a role, an unstated role in the community. It can come from issues of race, ethnicity, gender, power dynamics come to play in one way or another in all groups. So to be sensitive to them, seeing how they're playing out, and sometimes they need to be made overt to make it less toxic, and to really work it through with some serious group work. Figure out what are these power dynamics, how are they playing, and are they helpful or hindering us right now? Again, the touchstone is every individual is of the same inherent value. My personal set of values there. So I wanted to introduce you, some of you probably know this already. There's a psychological approach called Self-Determination Theory, comes out of the University of Rochester. And part of this theory talks about three basic psychological needs, three fundamental needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I'll go into what these three fundamental psychological needs are. I found this approach really helpful clinically. I've also found it helpful in terms of working in organizations, helping build organizations, and I thought I'd share my perspective on it with you around high-functioning groups, because I think it does apply to folks who have experienced trauma. For these psychological needs to really play out well, they require an environment with enough perceived safety on the part of group members to allow for openness to experience. That means not shutting down, not being defensive, not having the walls go up, not feeling unsafe. And how this happens really depends on the group's members and experiences as well as the environment. By autonomy, self-determination theory means perceived choicefulness. So from the point of view of the individual, does that person feel like she or he has real choices in life? Are there real choices to be made? Or are those choices all foreclosed and there's only one way to go? Environments can be supportive of a person having this perceived sense of autonomy or not. And environments that do support a feeling of perceived choicefulness lead to a lot of good outcomes, including intrinsically motivated behavior, meaning people do things for the love of doing it rather than because they're rewarded for doing something or punished for doing something else. By competence, I mean a person's sense of effectiveness in what they're doing. If they feel effective in what they're doing, they are more likely to want to keep doing it. If they feel ineffective, they're more likely to be disaffected and stop wanting to do something. How do you work on people's perceived competence being higher is making sure that the environment, the inputs, have the tasks and challenges at the right level for the participant. So people are at risk of being bored if the tasks and challenges aren't at the right level. If you have group work and people are feeling it's a waste of time, it's just not at their level, people can opt out pretty quickly. Alternately, if there's work that hasn't had the right backup to it, it hasn't had the right training in front of it, you may have people feeling that they're not competent to do the task, and that can also lead to opting out and also loss of feelings of self-worth. So tasks within the group need to be scaffolded appropriately to avoid boredom and also a feeling of a low self-efficacy. We want to make sure people are feeling competent and successful in the task that they're given. Relatedness here means relatedness to others, but it also means relatedness to one's self. And a person's perceived relatedness is related to intrinsic motivation and to lots of positive social outcomes too. So a work environment or a group environment can encourage or it can get in the way of a person's perceived relatedness. And one thing here that is important for people who've had traumatic histories is more is not necessarily better in terms of the intimacy of relatedness. So the relatedness needs to be appropriate for the setting. And sometimes people can overshare and make people uncomfortable or leave themselves too vulnerable, whereas the safety of the setting hasn't yet been established. So what I mean by that is part of good work after trauma is knowing when to trust, when not to trust, when to feel safe, when not to feel safe. And sometimes if there's oversharing with an expectation or an attempt to achieve a relatedness or a connection, it can push people away. So, and that can lead to negative implications for the individual too. So we want relatedness, we want connectedness, but it needs to be appropriate for the setting. Let's be careful out there, meaning we want to do no harm. We have an accountability as leaders for the well-being of our patients, our staff, our consumers, our participants. And that needs to be a job one. So the emotional climate of the setting takes precedence over, we've got to get through this agenda. We're behind, let's push through, let's make sure it gets done. There can be a can-do, let's just get it done attitude that sometimes can steamroll individuals in a group, and that's potentially a risk. Re-traumatization is always possible. We need to be sensitive to that if we want the group to be trauma-informed. Our caregivers, our community health workers, our front desk folks, our consumers, our participants in cabs, our participants on consumer majority boards. There are risks. There are the IHI, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, is just now going from a triple aim to a quadruple aim. What's that? Well, it's beginning to recognize the risks, including burnout, to caregivers. We need to be always aware of the risk to people who have been exposed to trauma in terms of personal trauma or vicarious trauma, the risk of doing harm through re-traumatization to our stakeholders and our community members. So first and foremost, let's be careful out there. Many of the people we work with are in recovery, whether it's substance abuse or recovery from mental illness. I wanted to talk about a risk that I've seen in my clinical work over the years, which is the pressure of being a role model or having role model status. Someone who has had a life history of challenges, of having difficulties, of being seen as having not succeeded at many times, or having a history of being seen as succeeding and then having a period where that success goes away. There can be particular pressures and difficulties for people who have experienced that in their lives. Getting to what feels comfortable or normal, having that be normal, having that be comfortable, being a leader, being successful, that doesn't come right away. That might not be what's comfortable. What's comfortable might feel for some people a period of success followed by a period of perceived failure from the outside. Getting used to being comfortable with the new roles, with sobriety, with pro-social participation in groups, that might take some time. So we want to be very mindful of not propping people up as role models until they've really gotten comfortable with their limitations, as we all have limitations, with their risks, with what's a yellow flag, what's a red flag, where do they go for help when they need it. Otherwise, we might be putting people in harm's way. And what we want to do is develop these proactive solutions, anticipating that there are going to be challenges to recovery in the work that we do. We can't just assume that people, once they've achieved sobriety or in recovery for a period of time, that there won't be risks to the sobriety, risks to the recovery. We need to develop the proactive solutions relevant to the group because things happen. Humor. This could be very, boring, but humor is very powerful. And, laughter is a wonderful medicine. So it has its place, of course. And for people to be able to laugh at themselves in a way that doesn't really put themselves down, and to laugh at the absurdity of the world, this is great. But when a group leader or facilitator or even a group member uses humor, even if it's meant innocently, we really don't know how that communication of humor is going to be received. So just be very sensitive to the different perspectives of the group members, what you know, and especially what you don't know. Because, you know, what's funny to me or to anyone listening to this might be very unfunny to someone else. And a lot of what goes into humor has to do with discomfort. Sometimes at the root of what's funny is an uncomfortable truth or possible truth or perspective. And sometimes we really want people to feel uncomfortable. It's about consciousness raising, or it's about just shaking up a boring scene. But if you're not looking to make some people feel uncomfortable, have a really, really tight filter on your humor, because you might never know who got hurt by that humor. And people didn't sign up to go to a comedy club. They signed up to go to that meeting. And you might not know whom you offended. Catherine, would you like to take it from here?
All right. Thank you, Nick. That was very insightful, and I enjoyed hearing your insights into how we create safe spaces. From here, we're going to wrap up this webinar talking about what organizations can do in order to best be supporting the development of trauma-informed leadership skills, and also some of these safe space considerations for our consumer leaders. One thing we want to start with is acknowledging that local organizations, local communities, local consumer boards, they know what their needs are. They know what is best for them. So it is important to really be engaging our consumers, our consumer leaders, our staff, and our organizations in conversations about what supports are necessary and what a plan would look like. So we're going to give some ideas of some suggestions here, but we want to make sure that in a trauma-informed way that local communities are really empowered to make these decisions for themselves. But when we talk about some suggestions for how this should look or how this could look, there are three things that we think are important for organizations to be considering, and that's really what are the needs and the goals of this group, what skills do they feel like they have, what skills do they want to develop, and who do you know in your community or in your staff that can help best support the development of those skills. Who can you bring in to help train on that, and what resources do you have to support it? And then finally, what the best thing is to do is we want to make sure that we are developing a plan for how are we implementing this, but also how do we evaluate it? How are we making sure that, as we said, that this is learning is a consistent process. We want to be a community of learners. So how are we developing some plans for how we implement some trainings, how we learn certain skills, how we practice those skills, but also how do we evaluate in the future? What do we need to know? What do we want to continue to do? What works and what doesn't work? So making sure that we have a plan for both implementation and evaluation. Some of the organizational supports that we recommend, we think are important for the development of our consumer boards and our consumer leaders are going to be organizational commitment to sharing knowledge and expertise. As I mentioned before, our staff are a great resource in their clinical knowledge around some of these skills we talked about earlier, and also in understanding what trauma-informed care is. So having our staff really committed to coming in, helping train our consumers so we are using our resources as best as possible is great. We also need to be thinking about what staff support looks like for the consumer board itself. Staff support is very important in helping form the relationship between the organization and the board, and staff support is necessary in being connected to some of the administrative work of a consumer advisory board, but also in the decision-making process. We hope you enjoyed your time with us today learning about trauma-informed consumer leadership. We do want to offer another opportunity for you here. This is a bit of a teaser. We will be having a full-fledged learning lab at this year's conference. It's going to be a learning lab that is hosted by our National Consumer Advisory Board. This is a national group of 12 consumers who have been working on how do you train on trauma and trauma-informed care. They're going to be leading conversations about what is trauma-informed care, how do we talk to consumers about these things in ways that are accessible and understandable and relatable for our consumers, and then practical applications of how our consumers can be really creating safe spaces. So more of a deeper dive than we've done today in terms of the skills and the tools and how we make sure our spaces, our consumer-led spaces, are as safe as possible. So what you got here in an hour, they will be teaching us in 4 hours as a bit of a train the trainers opportunity for consumer leaders. So we would hope you would all join us for that learning lab. As you can see, there is a web links box on your screen right now where you can click to learn more about these learning labs or register for the conference. And we would hope to see you at this learning lab and this year's conference. We're going to close out right now with just a couple questions that we received during this webinar. So the first question that I have looks like, do you have suggestions for how to encourage staff to do emotional intelligence work?
This came from Annalene, and I wanted to encourage everyone to check for understanding when there is a complicated or emotionally laden interaction. Checking for understanding. I mean, you might think you understood what happened, but sometimes asking whether the communication happened right can really avoid going down the wrong path. Making sure you understood what was communicated. If you do that routinely, checking for understanding, you can train yourself by learning where you make mistakes and to doing a better job at seeing how you're being seen. So if you say something and someone looks like they're not really getting it, and you check for understanding, you may learn what a poor communicator in a certain area you might be and how you can improve that. And I think that's maybe a component of emotional intelligence. Thank you for that question.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. Our second and last question for today is going to be, when it comes to people who have experienced trauma engaging with one another, like they do on a cab, how do you recommend managing the fact that some people's traumatic experiences cause them to withdraw, while others' symptoms cause them to be more aggressive or assertive? Nick, do you want to take that as well?
Sure, Catherine. First thing is it's a very thoughtful question. The second part of the question, some people's traumatic experiences cause them to withdraw, while others' traumatic symptoms cause them to become more assertive or aggressive. Just understanding that can help in a situation. Sometimes when we see someone being loud or assertive or aggressive, we tend to recoil from that, or we tend to, start feeling less safe as our primary response, missing the fact that that person might have just been triggered, and that person might be trying to protect himself or herself by being more loud. And there might have been something that happened that got that person into their more amped up self, into their more amped up defensive self. And some people act aggressively or offensively as a way of keeping people away, as a way essentially to keep safe. Other people are anxious, more withdrawn, or may leave. So seeing that different behaviors might have some commonalities in an underlying cause can be really helpful in terms of what happened, because then you can try to look for, well, what might have been a trigger for that? Specifically, knowing your group members, potentially through prior knowledge or some pre-screening, can help you predict or at least understand when something's unfolding, what just happened there, as a way of lessening or mitigating the harm in the moment through a debriefing or a subsequent interview, and also trying to avoid whatever might have triggered that in the future.
Thank you, Nick, for that advice and that insight. That was wonderful. And thank you, everyone else, for joining this webinar today, Fostering Trauma-Informed Consumer Leadership. A link of the archived webinar and the PowerPoint slides will be available on our website, www.nhchc.org, at the conclusion of our spring virtual training. Hope you all have a great day. Thank you.